the promise made off camera. It wasn't meant for the public. No microphones, no witnesses, just a promise spoken quietly and believed. In the White House, public commitments are carefully shaped, but private promises often carry more weight. They create expectations without accountability. Today, in a world where nearly everything is recorded, it's easy to assume nothing important happens off camera. Yet some of the most binding moments occur precisely because no one is watching. The absence of an audience does not diminish the gravity of what is said. The promise was made during a pause, a break between meetings, a moment when guards relaxed and formality dissolved. The setting felt safe enough for honesty. The words were not dramatic. They didn't sound historic, but they implied action, and implication can be powerful. It is often in these unguarded intervals, the hallway conversation, the exchange before cameras resume rolling, that the most consequential things are communicated. At the time, the promise felt reasonable, a way to reassure, to maintain trust, to move a relationship forward without committing publicly. Both sides understood the subtext. This was not policy. It was intention. And intention, in the right moment, can feel as solid as any signed agreement. What made the promise dangerous was its ambiguity. Without documentation, its meaning lived entirely in memory. Each person heard what they needed to hear. Each assumed alignment that did not truly exist. Memory is a subjective instrument. It records not just what was said, but what was hoped, what was feared, what was needed. As days passed, expectations formed. Decisions were interpreted through the lens of that private assurance. When actions didn't immediately follow, confusion emerged. Not publicly, but internally. Silence where momentum was expected. The administration, meanwhile, moved cautiously. The promise had never been vetted, never approved. It sat outside process, awkwardly influencing perception without shaping policy. Ignoring it felt like betrayal. Honoring it felt like overreach. Every course of action carried its own risk. Acknowledging the promise would give it formal weight it was never intended to carry. And so, the White House found itself navigating an invisible obligation, one that had never been formally accepted, yet could not be dismissed without consequence. What began as a quiet reassurance was becoming a silent constraint, and soon it would demand recognition. As the promise lingered, its influence deepened. It shaped expectations on one side, while remaining unacknowledged on the other. This imbalance created tension that could not be addressed openly. To address it openly would require first admitting its existence. And admission carried its own complications. Those who believed the promise adjusted their strategies accordingly. They delayed alternatives. They trusted timelines that were never confirmed. The assumption of future action replaced immediate planning. Hope became a substitute for certainty. This substitution is one of the more insidious effects of an undefined promise. It does not merely create false expectations. It actively displaces practical work that would otherwise fill the space. Inside the White House, awareness of the promise spread unevenly. Some knew fragments. Others sensed pressure without context. Because the commitment was informal, it could not be referenced directly. Conversations danced around it, careful not to expose its existence. This selective knowledge created its own complications. The danger of an off-camera promise is not deception, it is misalignment. When expectations form without shared understanding, disappointment becomes inevitable. And disappointment, when unspoken, hardens into resentment. Resentment is particularly corrosive in relationships that depend on trust, because it operates below the surface of official interaction, coloring every exchange without ever being named. As weeks passed, external actions began to signal impatience. Subtle shifts, coded language, indirect reminders. The White House recognized the pattern, but struggled to respond. Acknowledging the promise publicly would elevate it into obligation. Denying it would fracture trust. The conflict was now structural. The promise had created a relationship dynamic without a policy framework. It influenced behavior without authority. It constrained options without accountability. A promise made informally cannot be managed formally. Attempts were made to reinterpret the words, to narrow their meaning, to frame them as conditional rather than assured. But memory is resistant to revision. Once belief takes hold, clarification often feels like retreat. Reinterpretation, however carefully framed, tends to be received not as correction but as evasion. The person who believed the promise does not hear a more accurate reading of what was said. They hear withdrawal. The promise, once a tool of reassurance, had become a liability, not because it was broken, but because it existed at all. It had created a parallel reality, one where expectations moved faster than decisions, and that parallel reality was closing in on the official one. As pressure mounted, the promise began to surface indirectly. Questions arrived framed as assumptions. Requests implied prior agreement. Each interaction carried an expectation the White House had never formally accepted, yet could not fully deny. The texture of every communication had changed. What once felt like open negotiation now felt like the management of a commitment already made. The room for genuine discussion had narrowed. The administration attempted balance. Actions were calibrated to signal goodwill, without confirming commitment. But partial gestures often amplify confusion. They suggest progress while delaying resolution. The promise gained weight precisely because it was never addressed directly. Each incomplete action was read as confirmation that something had been agreed upon, that the process of delivery was underway. Each delay was read as a failure to deliver on what had already been promised. Internally, frustration grew. Advisors debated a commitment they could not quote. Strategy meetings circled an obligation that technically did not exist. The lack of clarity consumed energy that should have gone to policy. Hours that might have been spent on decisions with clear parameters were instead spent analyzing the implications of words no one had written down and no one could definitively interpret. The deeper conflict was emotional. Trust had been extended privately. Withholding fulfillment now felt personal, even if unintended. The White House was no longer managing a policy issue. It was managing a relationship shaped by expectation rather than agreement. Policy issues have defined resolution mechanisms. Relationship ruptures do not. As time passed, the cost of ambiguity increased. Each delay reinterpreted the promise. Each silence added meaning. What had been spoken casually now carried symbolic weight far beyond its original intent. The words had been spoken in a moment. They were now being lived across weeks and months, accumulating significance with every day that passed without resolution. Eventually, the administration faced an unavoidable choice: formalize the promise and accept its consequences, or disavow it and risk damage that could not be repaired quietly. Both paths carried loss. There was no option available that preserved everything. The moment for a clean outcome had passed, if it had ever existed at all. This is the danger commitments made without record. They remove the option to renegotiate openly. They transform intention into obligation without consent. And when reality diverges from expectation, trust absorbs the impact, not the process, not the policy. The promise made off camera had reached its breaking point, not because of what was said, but because of what was never clarified. The climax of this story arrives when ambiguity becomes impossible to sustain. The promise, once quiet and flexible, hardened under the weight of expectation. What had been spoken to reassure now demanded fulfillment. Silence was no longer neutral. It became a signal. Every day that passed without action was read as a day of deliberate withholding. When the White House finally acted, the response felt unsatisfying to everyone involved. Too much for those who feared obligation. Too little for those who believed assurance had been given. The original words, stripped of context, could not support the meanings built upon them. The resolution was not clean. Trust was not fully restored, nor was it completely broken. Instead, a subtle distance settled in, a recognition that private promises carry risks public commitments are designed to manage. This story reveals a simple truth about power. What is said off camera often matters more than what is announced publicly. But without clarity, those words can bind institutions in ways they were never meant to be bound. The informal register that makes private communication feel more honest also makes it more dangerous. Honesty without structure is not a virtue in systems that depend on accountability. The promise did not fail because it was dishonest. It failed because it was undefined. In systems built on accountability, ambiguity is not neutral. It is corrosive. It does not simply leave questions open. It fills those open questions with assumption, with hope, with fear, with projection. What remains is a lesson repeated across history. Intentions spoken privately must eventually face reality publicly. Otherwise, they linger as obligations no one agreed to, yet everyone feels. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The promise